Europe stood on the edge of collapse. The Muslim army swept across the continent, city after city falling. But then one man, Charles Martel, stood in their path and changed history forever. The world was burning. From the dunes of Arabia to the mountains of the Pyrenees, the crescent banner of Islam had swept across continents like a rising tide. Damascus had fallen to faith, Persia to fire, Egypt to zeal. North Africa followed, and then Spain, the proud Visigothic kingdom crushed in a storm of steel and flame. By 732 AD, the tide reached the very heart of Europe. From Al-Andalus came Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, governor of Córdoba, commander of tens of thousands of battle-hardened warriors. His cavalry, the light and deadly riders of the desert, had never known defeat. Gold and slaves poured from the conquered lands, and the warriors of the Crescent believed nothing could stop them. Abd al-Rahman's goal was clear: to strike north past the Pyrenees through Aquitaine and into the lands of the Franks, the road to Tours, the road to Paris, the road to the heart of Christendom. In their path stood Charles Martel, the mayor of the palace, not yet a king, but already the power behind one. He was no noble poet or courtly knight. He was iron, forged by war, hardened by necessity. They called him Martel the Hammer. He watched the smoke rising from southern villages, his jaw tight. "If we fail here," he told his commanders, "the cross will fall, and the sons of Europe will pray to a god not their own." The Franks had no walls to hide behind, no great empire to command. Only farmers with axes, peasants with spears, and a few thousand mailed warriors loyal to their grim leader. But Charles knew something the desert lords did not: patience. He gathered his men slowly, silently, letting the enemy advance deeper into Frankish lands. He chose his ground carefully, the wooded hills between Tours and Poitiers, where the Arab cavalry could not maneuver freely. There he waited, and when the scouts brought word that the Crescent army was near, 30,000 strong, Charles simply said, "Good, then they will find their graves here." The battle for Europe was about to begin. Autumn came crimson and cruel. The harvest burned before it could be reaped. From the south, the Muslim host surged through Aquitaine, swift, relentless, devouring the land like locusts. Cities that had stood since the days of Rome fell in days. Bordeaux burned first, its churches torn apart, its people scattered or slain. The smoke could be seen for leagues, rising like a dark omen. At the head of this army rode Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, mounted on a black Arabian steed, his armor shimmering like glass in the sun. He was no mere raider, he was a general, cold and brilliant. To his men, he promised the riches of Europe itself. To himself, he sought destiny. A world united under one faith. "France will be ours," he told his captains as they rode north. "Their kings are weak, their people divided. God has given them into our hands." Behind him, his men laughed and sang. For months they had swept across Gaul unopposed, their blades red, their saddlebags heavy with gold. But north of the Loire, another kind of silence awaited them. In a dark oak forest near Tours, Charles Martel gathered his army. Peasants and nobles, veterans and farmers. Rough men hardened by years of war. They wore no silks, carried no gold. They slept in the cold and sharpened their weapons by moonlight. Charles walked among them at night, his cloak heavy with dew. He spoke to them not as a king, but as one of their own. "They come to take your homes, your wives, your children," he said. "They think you are nothing, but tomorrow you will show them what the sons of the Franks are made of." He looked to the sky, dark clouds rolling in from the west. Rain would come, he knew. The ground would turn to mud, the air to mist. Perfect. Let the desert men fight in the cold, the wet, the forests they did not understand. The army of Islam marched ever northward, their banners glittering in the wind, their horses snorting steam. Ahead of them lay a quiet valley surrounded by trees, a place the Franks called the Field of Saints. Charles Martel looked across that valley and murmured, "They will not leave this field alive." He raised his war hammer, and the world held its breath. The wind turned cold, biting through armor and cloth. The forests around Tours whispered like old ghosts. their leaves falling in gold and crimson. In those woods, Charles Martel's army waited, silent, patient, immovable. They were not soldiers of luxury or empire. They were men of the soil, farmers, hunters, sons of the north, hardened by hunger and faith. Their shields were plain, their swords dull from years of use, but their hearts burned with something no gold could buy: the will to defend their land. Charles rode among them, his heavy destrier snorting clouds of mist. He wore no crown, no gilded armor, only chainmail blackened from years of battle. His hammer hung at his side, simple, unadorned, deadly. "Hold your ground," he told his captains. "Do not chase them, do not break ranks. The forest is our fortress, and patience is our sword." To the untrained eye, his position seemed defensive. The Franks were arrayed in a tight phalanx upon the ridge, shields locked shoulder to shoulder. But behind that stillness lay a trap. Charles had chosen the ground carefully. A narrow plateau hemmed by woods, where the Muslim cavalry could not surround or charge. As his men took their places, scouts returned, breathless, terrified. "They're coming," one gasped. "The valley glitters with steel." And indeed, the horizon shone with the approach of Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi's army. The crescent banners rippled in the wind, rows upon rows of horsemen filling the plain. 30,000 warriors, their armor dazzling, their lances bristling like a field of spears. Abd al-Rahman himself rode at the front, surrounded by his elite guards. He saw no walls, no fortresses, only the dark line of Franks waiting among the trees. He smiled. "A line of peasants and priests," he said. "One charge, and they will break like reeds." He raised his scimitar toward the sky. "Ride! For Allah and for glory!" The desert roared to life. The thunder of hooves shook the ground as thousands of cavalrymen surged forward, a living tide of flesh and iron. The Franks stood unmoving, shields raised, their leader silent at their center. "Hold," Charles whispered. "Hold, until they break upon us." The storm was coming, and the hammer waited to fall. The ground trembled. The thunder of hooves rolled across the valley like the heartbeat of war itself. The Muslim cavalry surged forward, 30,000 strong, a tidal wave of speed and power. The flash of curved blades caught the sun, and their cries of "Allahu Akbar" echoed through the woods. The air shook with the sound of drums and horns. The Franks did not move. At the center of the ridge, Charles Martel stood beneath his tattered banner, a simple cross stitched in white. His men gripped their shields so tightly their knuckles bled. "Hold," he said again, his voice calm amid the storm. The first wave of cavalry struck the Frankish line with the force of an avalanche. The impact was deafening. Wood splintered, men screamed, horses reared, but the line did not break. The Franks stood shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, spears braced. The horses impaled themselves on the wall of iron. When the smoke cleared, the Franks countered short, brutal thrusts, axes rising and falling. There was no elegance, no art, only survival. The narrow terrain trapped the Muslim riders, denying them their greatest weapon, speed. "Push!" Martel roared, swinging his war hammer into the chest of a charging horseman. The blow crushed both man and mount in a single strike. The cavalry recoiled. Abd al-Rahman watched from a distance, his brow furrowed. "Again!" he commanded. "Break their center." The second charge came, faster, angrier. The Frankish line buckled but held. The fields of Tours became a cauldron of blood and screams. Arrows hissed through the air. The Muslims cut down dozens, but every man who fell was replaced by another. For hours, the two armies clashed. When night began to fall, the valley was carpeted with bodies. Neither side could claim victory, only exhaustion. As darkness settled, Charles gathered his captains around a dying fire. His armor was dented, his beard matted with sweat and dust. "They will come again tomorrow," one of them said. "They are too many." Charles looked toward the horizon, where the glow of the enemy campfires lit the night like a serpent of flame. "Then tomorrow," he said, "we finish it." He stood and raised his hammer toward the stars. We are the wall between night and dawn. Hold and Europe lives. Break and all the world burns. The men nodded in silence. And somewhere beyond the darkness, Abd al-Rahman sharpened his blade and swore by God that at sunrise, the cross would fall. Dawn bled across the battlefield like a dying ember. Mist clung to the trees, veiling the carnage of the previous day. Shattered lances, bodies frozen in prayer, and the iron stink of blood that soaked the soil. From the south came the echo of horns. The Muslim army was forming again, 30,000 strong, their banners rippling through the fog. Their commander, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, rode at the center, his armor shining like a black flame. "Today," he called, "we break the Franks and ride to Paris. There will be no more kingdoms between us and the sea." Across the valley, the Franks stirred. Cold, hungry, and exhausted, they rose from the ground like phantoms. 30,000 men wrapped in furs and mail, their faces streaked with ash. They made no speeches. They simply took their places behind Charles Martel, their hammer of war. The mist thickened. The horns fell silent. For a heartbeat, there was only the slow, rhythmic beat of shields against earth. Boom, boom, boom. Then, from the fog, the cavalry charged once more. The impact came like the sky collapsing. Horses screamed, blades flashed, and the front lines erupted into chaos. The Muslims fought with dazzling speed, curved swords slicing through armor, arrows raining down from behind. But the Franks did not yield. They fought like a wall of iron, slow and merciless. Every time a knight fell, another stepped into his place. Spears thrust forward, axes hacked through armor. The air was a storm of steel. In the thick of it, Charles Martel swung his hammer with both hands, breaking shields, crushing skulls. "Hold the line," he bellowed. "For your fathers, for your sons." The Muslim cavalry swirled around them again and again, trying to find a weak point. But in the narrow ground between the trees, speed became death. Riders crashed into each other, their momentum lost in the tangled terrain. Hours passed. The fog lifted, and for the first time, Abd al-Rahman saw the truth. His army was bleeding away, its formation dissolving. The Frankish line stood, dented, scarred, but unbroken. Still, he refused to retreat. Drawing his curved sword, he rode into the thick of battle, rallying his men. "Forward!" he cried. "Allah is with us." A volley of javelins answered. One struck him in the chest. He fell without a sound. When his men saw him fall, a ripple of horror spread through the ranks. The heart of the Muslim army had stopped beating. Charles Martel raised his hammer to the sky and roared, "Now!" The Franks surged forward with a fury born of exhaustion and faith. The crescent banners buckled, wavered, and fell. By sunset, the Valley of Tours belonged to the cross. The sun was sinking behind the trees when the Muslim army finally broke. What had begun as an invasion ended in chaos. A sea of fleeing riders, horses crashing into one another, banners torn to shreds. The air reeked of blood and sweat, the ground slippery beneath the weight of the dead. From his vantage on the ridge, Charles Martel watched the rout unfold. The battlefield was littered with shattered scimitars and broken lances, the remnants of a force that had once boasted it would conquer all of Europe. But the Franks, tired, battered, their armor cracked and their hands raw from gripping weapons, stood victorious. The Muslim camp, vast and glittering with plunder, still sprawled behind the hills. Tents of silk, golden trinkets, and the spoils of Aquitaine filled the valley like a fallen empire's dream. Yet Charles did not move his army forward. He knew better than to chase a retreating enemy into the dusk. "Let them run," he said grimly. "Night will hunt them for me." Indeed, night did. As the Franks held their lines, the survivors of Abd al-Rahman's army fled south in disarray, pursued not by soldiers but by cold and fear. Without their commander, discipline vanished. They left their treasure, their weapons, their dead. When dawn came, scouts found the enemy's camp abandoned. Among the spoils lay the body of Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, pierced by javelins, his black armor dulled by dust. Charles Martel rode to the site himself. For a long time he said nothing. Then he dismounted, removed his helmet, and looked upon his fallen foe. "He was a lion," Charles murmured, "and I have slain him." The priests who accompanied the army gathered and began to chant prayers over the field, the voices of monks rising softly amid the silence of the dead. For 7 days, Charles remained in the area, watching, waiting, ensuring the invaders did not return. He took no glory, no parades, no boastful speeches. When his captains urged pursuit, he shook his head. "No," he said, "this land has already drunk enough blood. Let the survivors tell their own story, that Europe is not for the taking." By the second week, the last of the invaders had vanished across the Pyrenees. The banners of the Crescent retreated into Spain, never to return. The Franks buried their dead where they fell, marking the graves with simple wooden crosses. And as the mist settled over the Valley of Tours, the people whispered that a miracle had happened, that God himself had wielded the hammer that day. The battlefield lay quiet. The smell of smoke still hung heavy, but the killing was done. The valley between Tours and Poitiers, once green, now red with blood, became a tomb for thousands. The Franks moved slowly through the wreckage, gathering the wounded, stacking the fallen, whispering prayers for brothers who would never rise again. The silence after battle was worse than the noise, a silence filled with ghosts. Charles Martel stood among them, his cloak torn, his mail dented, his hammer dark with blood. He was exhausted, hollowed out by the weight of what had been done. But he stood tall, unmoved by glory. A priest approached, bowing low. "My lord, it is over. God has given you victory." Charles looked out over the valley. The mist was rising again, curling around the bodies, hiding the horror beneath a veil of gray. "No," he said quietly. "God has given us warning. Europe has awoken, and she will not sleep again." His captains gathered around, men who had fought through the storm, grim warriors with eyes that had seen too much. "What shall we tell the people, my lord?" asked one. "That you have saved Christendom?" Charles wiped his hammer clean on the grass. "Tell them nothing. Let them till their fields and raise their children. Let them forget this day if they can. We fought not for glory, but for peace." And yet word spread. Across the monasteries of Gaul, the monks wrote by candlelight. "In the year of our Lord 732, Charles, called Martel, the Hammer, did defeat the Saracens near Tours and turned back the tide of the East." The chroniclers would call it the battle that saved Europe. But the men who fought it remembered only the sound, the clash of iron, the screams in the fog, the sight of their comrades falling beside them. They remembered the hammer rising and the crescent breaking. In the days that followed, the people of Aquitaine emerged from their hiding places, crossing themselves as they passed the field of the dead. The invaders were gone, their threat broken, and in the stillness that followed, something unseen shifted, a continent reborn. For the first time, the Franks, the Lombards, the Saxons, and all the scattered peoples of the West began to whisper a single word: Europe. It would take centuries to forge, centuries more to hold, but the fire had been lit here, in blood, in faith, in silence. And at its heart stood one man, Charles the Hammer. Winter came early that year. Frost crept across the meadows of Gaul, whitening the graves at Tours. Crows circled above the silent field where the armies of two worlds had met and shattered. In the monasteries, the monks wrote of the miracle that had saved Christendom. But for Charles Martel, there was no miracle, only men, blood, and resolve. He returned to his capital not as a triumphant conqueror, but as a man burdened with memory. His soldiers, those rough, weathered Franks, followed him home in silence. No songs, no parades, only the echo of hooves on frozen roads. When they reached the northern plains, the people gathered to see them. Farmers, shepherds, and widows lined the roads, crossing themselves as the warriors passed. Some wept, others whispered prayers of gratitude. A young monk approached Charles, kneeling beside his horse. "My lord," he said, "they say you saved the world." Charles looked down, his eyes shadowed. "No, brother," he said, We only bought it time. He knew the truth. The victory at Tours had not ended the threat. It had only delayed it. The world was still fragile. Europe still divided. Its kingdoms ruled by greed and pride. But for the first time in generations, men began to believe that the West could endure. In his hall that winter, Charles summoned his nobles. The fire roared behind him as he stood before the gathered lords. Men who had once doubted, mocked, and defied him. "You saw what came from the south," he said. "An army that crossed oceans and mountains to devour our faith. It will come again, if not in our days, then in the days of our sons. So build, train, unite. Let there never again be a Frank or a Burgundian, but only men who stand for this land." Silence followed. Then, slowly, his captains rose and struck their fists against their chests. "For the hammer," they said. "For the Franks. For the cross." That night, Charles walked alone to the chapel. The flicker of candlelight danced over the altar as he knelt. "Lord," he whispered, "if I have done your will, let your peace fall upon this land. If I have only delayed the storm, then give strength to those who will come after me." Outside, the wind howled through the oaks, the same wind that had carried the clash of swords at Tours. It whispered through the night, carrying a single truth. From the ashes of battle, a civilization had been born, and its heartbeat was the hammer's echo. Years passed, and the story of Tours spread like holy fire. Across the monasteries of Christendom, monks copied the tale into parchment. How Charles Martel, servant of God, turned back the tide of Islam and saved the West. But Charles himself spoke little of it. He grew older, heavier, his beard streaked with gray. His victories had made him the most powerful man in Europe, yet he still refused the title of king. "Let the name of ruler be for my sons," he said. "I am only the hammer that shapes the blade." Under his rule, the Franks grew strong. Roads were rebuilt, churches restored, fields replanted. The people who had once lived in fear began to hope again. Yet at night, when the fires burned low, Charles still saw the battlefield. The fog, the fallen, the faces of those who never returned. Victory had its ghosts. One winter evening, he summoned his eldest son, Pippin, to his chamber. The young man, tall and proud, knelt before him. "My son," Charles said, "men will tell you that Tours was a miracle. They will call me the savior of Christendom. But remember this, no battle is won by one man. It was the courage of peasants, the faith of priests, the strength of our people that broke the tide. Rule them well, or their courage will turn to dust." Pippin bowed his head. "And if the tide returns?" Charles smiled faintly. "Then strike again, harder." He looked toward the window, where the moon hung bright above the frost. "There will always be another invader, another darkness. That is the way of the world. Our task is not to end it, only to stand against it." In the years that followed, Charles Martel's legend grew. They called him Martellus, the hammer of God, defender of the faith. Poets sang of the day when 30,000 Franks stood like a wall and crushed the might of the East. But to those who knew him, he remained the same, silent, stern, and unyielding. When he died, the chroniclers wrote that his hammer was laid upon his tomb, a symbol of strength and faith. Pilgrims came from distant lands to pray beside it, whispering thanks to the man who had given Europe a second dawn. And far to the south, in Córdoba, scholars still spoke his name, not in hatred, but in awe. The Frankish lion, they called him, who stopped the wind from the desert. The world had changed forever. The hammer had forged the West. Centuries passed, and the battle faded into legend. The field between Tours and Poitiers turned green again, its scars hidden beneath grass and wildflowers. Yet beneath the soil slept the bones of two worlds, one that sought to conquer, and one that refused to die. The chronicles would call it Bellum Pictivens, the Battle of Tours, but the monks who illuminated the tale in gold ink wrote a simpler truth. On that day, God held back the tide. The scholars of future ages would debate it endlessly, whether the Franks had truly saved Europe or merely slowed the inevitable march of empire. But for those who lived through it, no doubt remained. Something ended there, and something was born. When Charles Martel was laid to rest, they buried him not as a king but as a guardian. His tomb bore no crown, no jewels, only the image of a hammer carved in stone, its head pointing east, toward the lands he had turned back. Priests prayed in whispers. Here lies the hammer of the Franks, who stood when the world faltered, and in his standing saved it. From his blood would rise the Carolingian dynasty, Pippin the Short, and then Charlemagne, who would build an empire from the ashes of the Dark Ages. The dream of a united Christendom, of learning and faith reborn, began here, in the mud and blood of Tours. And so the chain of destiny stretched forward, from Martel's stand to Charlemagne's crown, from the broken ranks of peasants to the cathedrals of Europe, from that single clash of faith and fury to 1,000 years of history. But legends remember not the cold, or the fear, or the silence after battle. They remember only the moment when the hammer rose, and the tide broke. In the valley where it happened, the wind still whispers across the hills, carrying faint echoes of horns and hooves. Travelers pause there and feel something in the air, something vast, unseen, unending. Perhaps it is the memory of men who stood when all seemed lost. Perhaps it is the voice of the earth itself, murmuring gratitude. For on that autumn day in 732, the world held its breath, and Europe was born.